Good afternoon. So this is actually an amazing panel because it combines two of my passions, which is sustainability as well as blockchain, in one topic, which is pretty wild. We wanted to get a guy called Satoshi Nakamoto on the stage for the panel, but we couldn't reach him. So we actually have something even better. We have the people who took the genesis of that idea and have made it better, which is Staci, who is the CEO of the Algorand Foundation. We have Jean on the other side, who is the CEO and chairman for Chia. And we're supposed to have Jaynti on the line, the co-founder for Polygon.
There we go.
Welcome. Amazing. Technology works. And of course, we have John Lee here, who's the managing director and head of digital assets for Accenture. With that, we'll get going. What we wanted to talk about, topic, greenest blockchain. So obviously, we're talking about blockchain as well as the green effect. And the big topic in the room for that is the consensus mechanism that blockchains run. And I wanted to start off and have a quick run through of what are the consensus mechanisms that the different networks use, why they use them, and what the trade-off is in that space, and what will work well with them and not. We'll actually start with...
No, I just wanted to say, though, that if anybody is busy and you need to get to someplace else, Algorand is the greenest blockchain. So that's the one-liner on the panel.
Yeah. We're supposed to have Slido and the iPad. The one thing that was not supposed to happen with the iPad locking out happened. So maybe somebody can help us with that. But nevertheless, there is a Slido. Please submit us your question to this awesome panel. And sorry, since we're online with Jaynti, maybe, Jaynti, why don't you start off with the question on consensus mechanisms, what the trade-offs are that you see, and why you made the choice that you made. Oh, your audio isn't coming through yet?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Polygon is the quietest blockchain, though.
Try again. Do you want to try again, Jaynti? Nope, not yet.
Nope.
OK, why don't we come back to you? And Jean, why don't we start with you first, please?
Well, sure. Look, so let's back up and talk about the three major types of consensus mechanisms. There's broadly proof of work, proof of stake, and proof of space and time. Proof of space and time being the newest iteration on this. One of the things to know about proof of stake is that it is really an older technology. It is a technology that, in many ways, proof of work was designed to fix. And so it makes a lot of trade-offs to be more efficient around security. The problem you get into is that depending on how valuable what you're trying to do is, proof of stake chains can be bought and sold at consensus layers. There's an important number here called the Nakamoto coefficient. It is the kind of number of people necessary to round up to make the next block. Most proof of stake chains are sub 10 and some are sub 4 or sub 2. Ethereum after the merge is probably sub 2, which is kind of a dangerous thought. Proof of space and time.
So just repeat it. What's that Nakamoto coefficient again?
I believe Ethereum's is 2 or 1, depending on whether you count Lido having 51% yet or not. But you can add Coinbase and Binance together, and you can actually make the next block or censor transactions in Ethereum. And so that's one of the challenges of proof of stake. When you delegate stake, and almost everyone ends up delegating stake, it becomes a very centralized thing. Proof in space and time, brand new technology. We spent 5 years in R&D, and this is Bram Cohen of BitTorrent fame.
Did you just say you spent 5 years on R&D?
Yes. You had to invent proofs of space, you had to invent proof of time, and you had to make a better consensus, or probably a better security environment. But having done that, what we've built is what is the world's largest blockchain by node count ever. We peaked out at about 300,000 full nodes and have about 110,000 full nodes today. That compares to Bitcoin's peak about 6 years ago of 210,000 full nodes and only about 45,000 nodes today. And it is extremely energy efficient. It's 800 times more efficient than proof of work on the same security basis. It is slightly more expensive.
Proof of work, but really, right now, nobody uses proof of work anymore other than
Bitcoin. Yeah. But if you want the granddaddy of security, you want Bitcoin. And that's a problem, right? When you're talking about between governments using blockchains, these security components really matter. And for a fair comparison, proof of space and time uses about 0.19 terawatt hours a year, and it looks like that Ethereum 2 or Ethereum post-merge is going to use 0.18. So we're almost as efficient, but when you actually do the analysis, we're much more efficient on a per node basis because the actual kind of Ethereum number is about 3,000, 4,000 nodes. that actually fully validate versus our 110, 120,000 nodes that validate.
Okay. Can we try Jaynti again, see if the technology works now?
Yeah, hi. Can you
Yes,
hear me now?
perfect.
Excellent.
Yeah, so at Polygon, we use proof of stake. So it doesn't mine any kind of blocks as Bitcoin is doing. You don't burn any electricity. You just put your money tokens on the system, and that will take care of the system security, as like the validators are putting some kind of skin in the game in the system. So it's very hard, like very low probability of um, cheating the system. So it's quite kind of very popular consensus mechanism in the wild, in the Web3 ecosystem. I think apart from Polygon, now Ethereum is also moved from proof of work to proof of stake, and that's where we reduce the electricity and the energy consumption. And the second part, we also creating different technology called ZK EVMs. So ZK EVMs basically creates the zero knowledge based proofs for the transactions. So you kind of can create your transaction proof locally and submit for the blockchain. So blockchain just need to kind of take those transactions and creates the need to create just simple block proofs, and you don't need to kind of execute or validate your transactions in the network. So it basically brings down the execution from multi validator, multi node system to only one node. So it's basically brings down the consumptions very, very low. And we are going to go live very soon with that in production, maybe Q1, early Q1 next year.
So what we are also interested in is the trade-off that comes with it. So if it does something better, very often it does another thing slightly worse.
Yes, definitely. So now, so for example, in proof of stake systems, your transactions gets like confirmed very easily, like very in few seconds. But if you, for example, go with the zero knowledge proofs, it takes a lot of time to create the proof sometimes, depending upon the complexity of the transactions. So sometimes it takes time, but what we are going to do is that we are going to combine that with the partial finality of the transactions. So now, like you have maybe you can say like your transactions are partially confirmed, and after a few minutes you will get your full finality using the zero knowledge proof. So this is kind of trade-offs we are talking about, but I think in the longer term, the window of creating the proof will be smaller over in few years, and it will also be very, very efficient going forward, because people are kind of researching on the bringing the proof time towards zero, towards few milliseconds, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Staci, Algorand?
Let me just level set for a quick minute. Who here owns crypto of any kind? Bitcoin has ever... Okay, all right, so not a ton of people in the room. Maybe, let me just kind of level set a little bit. The banking sector, if you take the top 100 banks and the top 100 hedge funds and you put them together, they admit they're like the 8th largest carbon emitter in the planet, just behind Russia, right? And so why is that? It's because banks, they move transactions from balance sheet to balance sheet to balance sheet in a correspondent banking system, right? The blockchain itself is fundamentally different than that, fundamentally different, from the ground up different. It is that all transactions write to one ledger, okay? So by its nature, it should be greener than the banking system, right? By its nature. The question is, if you're all going to write to one ledger, nobody can control that ledger because it's very insecure and it's very too much power for one entity. So how are you going to have this ledger sit on a bunch of different computers? Okay, so you sort of stipulate that you need to do that. How are these computers all going to agree with each other, talk to each other, agree on the order of transactions of that ledger? And some of them may be good and some of them may be evil. How are you going to do that? Satoshi Nakamoto is a genius. He is a genius because he came up with this idea that these computers would enter some kind of a contest, and whoever won that contest would get to append transactions to this ledger. That is very inherently it's like an arms race of energy. So it's built in, the fact that energy usage is there. You can't really do anything about it if you use this kind of proof of work system. So then people looked at that and they said, okay, proof of stake systems will be better. And every proof of stake blockchain basically does not use that much energy. So it's not really about Algorand versus another one. It's if you get away from that arms race of energy, you're going to be much more environmentally friendly. The problem with proof of stake, though, is that, and I'm simplifying a bit, kind of the rich get richer, and it's not very secure. Because it's not secure because it's like, what's the vector of attack? Oh, that guy over there with the big stake. You know, it's sort of obvious to everybody. And the more stake you have, the more of the coin that you can get, and so it's a little bit unequal. So that social component, which is part of ESG, is sort of a problem in proof of stake blockchains. So we are founded by Silvio Macaulay, who's a Turing Award winner in cryptography from MIT, tenured professor at MIT, like 20 years, and he invented a couple of things, or co-invented a couple of things that the whole ecosystem uses. One is called verifiable random functions, and the other is called zero-knowledge proofs.
Sorry, what was the first one again?
Verifiable knowledge functions and zero-knowledge proofs. I'm sorry, verifiable random functions and zero-knowledge proofs. So I'm not going to go into these, but he looked at the Bitcoin and blockchain ecosystem develop, and he said, I can probably build something better than that, basically was his idea. And in terms of the trade-offs that you mentioned, the three really, to put some specificity around it, are how can you be scalable, how can you be secure, and how can you be decentralized at the same time? And Vitalik Buterin, who is coming to speak tomorrow, and I recommend to everybody to go to that, says that, you know, these three, it's a trilemma. You can't have all three at the same time. So Sylvia said, you know, I think we probably can. And this consensus mechanism that he came up with is called pure proof of stake. I can go into it if you want. But the juice in all of these blockchains is, what is that consensus mechanism? We've all come up with different forms of it, but the idea is, how do you get all of these computers to talk to each other and agree to each other at the same time? And the way that he did it in just two or three sentences is, every algo that you hold, you're running like a little slot machine. Every algo runs a little slot machine. They don't, and if 3 pineapples come up, then your algos are picked, and then in a couple of rounds, you get to append the next block. This happens every 3.9 seconds, and it is so lightweight that you don't, unlike other chains, you don't actually get paid anything to participate in this process. So no money is given to you because you can run it off a laptop. In fact, before we were as performant as we are now, you could run it off a Raspberry Pi, actually. So, but anyway, this happens every 4.9 seconds. You're scalable because you're only picking several from thousands of nodes, and you're secure because nobody knows, not even you, if you're going to win this little lottery. So it's completely, you don't know who to attack. And of course, it's decentralized because you're picking among many. So that was his solution at Algorand to it. And so we are, you know, we do right now 6,000 transactions per second. We have final settlement, no forking, in 3.9 seconds. And yeah, green, baby.
Nice. So John, with all these blockchains now moving away from the proof of stake, is it even still a question on how green a blockchain is, or what would be the better topic?
Well, I think at the end of the day, when you look at a green blockchain, you need to fully understand what is it trying to do in the first place. And I find that for our clients, and in case everyone in the audience didn't realize, Accenture doesn't have its own blockchain platform. We're very much platform agnostic because we're more of a services organization. But at the end of the day, one of the things that we want to do is business transformation. And as we start looking at what, I'll call it, the commercial banking community, the wholesale markets community is looking at in terms of how the ecosystem's evolving and changing, one of the things to clearly look at is the operational expenditure of how you would actually run your business. And so when we take it from that context, I think as you start looking at these various platforms, you kind of have to understand what the use case is and then look at a fit for purpose perspective. And then take a broader look at, is this actually a business transformation play, or are you just doing the exact same thing on a new platform stack, and then at the end of the day, it ends up being more expensive because you kind of missed the point. And I think this is one of the key things that, you know, from an organizational perspective and an ecosystem shift perspective, we're starting to see a bit of that.
That's an interesting question on the use cases, and maybe for you, Staci, what use cases do you see? What are the most dominant? And is it profile pictures? Is it DeFi lending? And are there still use cases that we have yet to explore that we want to get to?
Yeah, so why don't I pick, so we are, when you buy carbon offsets to make sure that we use the energy of about 7 or 8 houses currently, and we make sure that we buy carbon offsets to offset any energy that we
What carbon offsets do you use, actually?
So we use Climate Trade. It's a platform built on Algorand, and we estimate how much we use, and we use our transaction fees are sub-penny, so we have quite low, negligible, really, transaction fees, and we put that money towards making sure that we buy carbon offsets for anything that we do first. Yeah. And it's built in, because we're a blockchain, we have to do it by smart contract, so it's built into a smart contract. So if an evil CEO comes later, they can't change that rule. We also have a couple, and one other in the climate space that I think is very interesting is something called Climate Watch. So these guys, and you can do this yourself, they do micro testing of air. And so they put these sensors around. You can put one in your backyard, and you're just feeding Climate Watch data all over the world. And the reason that it needs to be built on a blockchain is because you don't want to contribute data to a system that somebody else could tamper with it later. So if you're a mayor and your county is doing really well, you don't want the other mayor over there to start changing their data so that their data looks better. And so there's also in these things a tokenomics play where you can be rewarded for contributing your data. And anyway, so you can get, and the more that these guys build these things and sell these things, you've got this kind of Internet of Things talking to the blockchain, getting climate data directly. It's a pretty interesting public good play that they're doing. And then if you think beyond, I mean, I think when we talk about ESG, we tend to only talk about the E, but when you talk about the S and the G, these are also quite important. And we've got a couple of interesting things there. I'll just spend another minute talking about. One is called whole chain. So they enable you to look at your supply chain and to see where things are and if the promises made at different points in the supply chain are kept so that you can have visibility. And did you know that 80% of companies do not have full visibility into their supply chain, and 50% don't have any visibility at all into their supply chain? And so if you
are you saying that if 80% don't have visibility into their supply chain, you're saying 20% actually do?
20% have, well, 80% don't have full visibility.
Yeah.
So 20% may have full visibility. Yeah, I mean, if you can think about it that way. But the idea is that if you are in food, or you are in, or really in anything where you care about things like labor and environmental footprint or food quality, or if it's organic or not, and you can't see your whole supply chain, then what's the point? Yep. So these guys are out to change this. And then just a couple of things in identity. We could do a whole panel on this, but being able to prove your identity and marshal your identity. We've got a couple of guys, super smart guys based out of Zimbabwe, actually, that are building an identity play in Africa so that Africans can, it's hard to participate in the financial system if you can't prove your identity. So they're working on that particular issue. Another partner with us, we're working with big disaster relief organizations in the United States to deliver disaster relief funds on the blockchain. That has to be done on the blockchain because you need to take a picture of your living room that's flooded, send the picture, and know that the money is going to come immediately. So, right now in the United States, disaster relief organizations, they're flying with prepaid debit cards to hand out to people. I mean, it's just like, it's so antiquated and ridiculous. So we're trying to make some inroads into that to make that better for everybody. And these are the kinds of things that we're really, we're kind of the blockchain that can solve problems at scale because we have such good throughput and we've had no downtime. So these are the kinds of issues that we're going after with a real laser-like focus, these inclusion, financial inclusion, green kinds of applications. I think I'm on this panel because we're so focused in this area.
Nice.
Yeah.
Jaynti, on the use cases, can you share a few things that you see as dominant and also as desirable in the future? No, you're not coming through yet.
You need one of these, Jaynti.
Yeah, try again, please. Do you want to try again, Jaynti? Yep, now you're there.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, so we are kind of we have multiple applications being built on Polygon. For example, Starbucks, they are kind of doing the loyalty programs, NFTs, and DeFi, all those things. We also have in India, like recently, the police department did FIR on Polygon. So now, like there are some issues in India regarding like FIR and the actions on that. So that kind of we are trying to solve also on Polygon.
Sorry, can you
People
just
on
repeat that? What did you do for the police department in India?
So you can now like file your complaint on blockchain,
nice.
and yeah. So that is being built on. There is one state in India, they created COVID verification, COVID report verifications last year on blockchain. Apart from that, we are also kind of working with multiple organizations. For example, KlimaDAO, which is being built on Polygon and kind of working towards the sustainability environment and carbon negative applications. So they are also kind of looking at it, our consumptions, and seeing and buying credits depending upon the consumptions Polygon blockchain make. And many other use cases. For example, we are also doing some sea exploration with few organizations, students, and universities, which basically kind of take care of these sea lives, and multiple other use cases as well. Like for example, government. We are working with multiple governments in Africa, UK. To make sure, like, they also create some kind of charities on blockchain on Polygon.
Got it. I'm hoping that once you've submitted on the blockchain to the police that you're unhappy, that somebody is also looking at it and responding to it, and
so
submit here
you can
and forget about it.
So, yeah, there are multiple things you can do. So we are also working with the zero knowledge based privacies and identity. So you can kind of say, okay, this kind of I'm just giving an example, right? So if you want to provide your identity without revealing your data, you can always create the proofs and meet on the Ethereum on the Polygon chain. Using the Polygon ID and say, okay, you are KYC'd and you are above 18 without revealing anything apart from that, right? So those kind of mechanisms also provided with that, yeah.
Yeah, we should.
But John, I'm sure the most dominant use case in terms of volume must be in finance.
Within the entire sustainable finance space, I think it's exploding. And I think the one that most people are very familiar with is this whole proliferation of this term called green bonds. That's not necessarily a new term, but obviously it originally started with a marketing play because they realized that you slap green at the beginning just because of the entire attention to the ESG space. They were able to fully subscribe the book very, very quickly. And quickly, you started the whole term around greenwashing, when you actually look at what those investments are, they're not very green at all. So how do you actually go and solve a problem like that? So from a use case perspective, if you look at some of the data attributes that could be embedded in a tokenized green bond issuance, that can actually be fully auditable, traceable, to go back to say that, yeah, these investments are actually going into energy efficient or green related investments as described within the perspective, you've automatically increased the visibility, the transparency, and by definition, reduce the cost of how you would actually go forward. And so this is a market efficiency play at the end of the day.
Don't you have an online to offline issue? Like, how do you then?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to say that it's completely solved, but you can start to see the advancement in how the problem statement and where some of these solution stacks are starting to get together. And again, you're starting to see an evolution and a transformation. Anything to do with a blockchain-based solution has to be an ecosystem play. And some of the things from the early adopters were sort of in isolation. And you're starting to see that come together from a community standpoint. But the big one that I think, and again, bonds are not new. It's a debt instrument that, within the wholesale capital market space, people would know. But as you start to move into things like compliant markets and voluntary carbon, it's very, very obvious that the way the market infrastructure is laid out for the voluntary carbon market space is extremely infantile. It's got a lot of issues. manual reconciliation, and I hate to say this, but if you look at a verified carbon offset and how that's being transacted, the way that these things are being recorded is kind of like a slight upgrade to Microsoft Excel. And you realize that as the market starts to continue to grow, they need a solution. They need to figure out how to actually allow the market to grow and scale. And so when we talk to our clients, and especially some of the clarity that's come out of COP26, and obviously COP27 is right around the corner, one of the clear things that's coming out is the governments have gotten together and have started to realize that there needs to be some sort of a standardization to give some guidance to the global community and how you would actually go and curate these offsets. And that's happening. So how do you actually go and do that? And this is where we start to explore some of the platforms, and I know that I've been talking to Gene about Chia and sort of where that could fit. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest problems in the carbon market space right now is how can you audit and fully trace back that the carbon offset that you're buying is actually worth it, actually came from a green project. If it's defined as a scope 1 or scope 2 removal, if it's a nature-based and a scope 3 piece that that Staci was talking about in terms of the supply chain elements, are the data attributes there that would actually survive a third-party audit? And the cost to actually doing that. And this is where you start looking at commercial viability and how you would actually scale. The big guys, the big organizations, the big corporates have the balance sheet to be able to afford the procurement process to do this right now. But what about the SMEs? What about the other corporates that are there? So how can you actually go and scale this, knowing full well that the investing community right now is demanding more transparency and more disclosure on not just the E, but also the S and the G, because at the end of the day, if the clarity is not there, they will move their investment out of your organization and your market capitalization will shrink. So that demand driver is what's really pushing the innovation frontier, and people are outright looking for a solution.
Can I just say one thing on that? Because I think you made a very good point. There is definitely a garbage in, garbage out element to this, right? So you cannot, as soon as the blockchain needs to talk to the physical world, you're going to introduce a point of unknowing there. And so what you need to do is you need to find Internet of Thing type ways, embedding barcodes onto things so that you can really, it can be very digitized right from the beginning. But you're always going to, it's a very good point, you're always going to kind of run that risk when you talk to the physical world.
And look, I want to expand on John's point, right? So this is a real problem. The voluntary markets are kind of where this happens first. And the World Bank has chosen the Chia blockchain to be a first attempt to create some level of lack of double counting and accountability for these projects. So
for which projects?
For voluntary carbon.
For voluntary carbon,
right.
Yep.
So what's happened to date is the final proof of concept for the Climate Warehouse was wrapped up about 3 months ago. It was 11 nations, all of the voluntary registries. And the idea here is when you go through a registry, the registry is going to meta-registry effectively and publish the fact that you have made it through the registry, this year and this location is a carbon offset. So at least now you've got a chance to have people not go to 2 registries. And because you're dealing with the international community, you need an ability to name and shame, fundamentally. There's no real better way to have Japan and Costa Rica cooperate, per se. Now, bad example, they cooperate well, but when you're talking about the entire international community, that's not the case. So what's exciting about this is that the government of Singapore, AIDA, and the World Bank are launching and have announced it last week and will be going into production with the actual final Climate Warehouse, which they're now calling the Climate Action Data Trust, running on the Chia blockchain. And that's necessary but not sufficient to create the quality we're all talking about. The next step is initiatives like we announced with the IFC to actually go out and create a higher standard along the voluntary carbon market standards that are being discussed today, so that if you go through a registry, you go through a Vera or you go through the Colombian registry and you get your tonnage tokenized, that you'll then be able to say, hey, but my tonnage is better even than, say, the Vera standard. I want to be at the IFC standard. And so you'd actually have a market instrument that was kind of commoditizing all of these various carbon coins into something that's available globally on centralized exchanges, on decentralized exchanges, kind of going to the core values that blockchains bring, which is they bring you this ability to have immutability and append-only data sets, and they build markets very, very well.
Okay. I just wanted to ask the organizers, we have the ability to put questions through Slido. Maybe the organizers can put up the instructions on how to get into the Slido on the screen again, so that we can get questions from the audience later as well. Jean, I did want to ask you just one more time, given that you literally spent 5 years to sort of reinvent some of the technology and build a very different consensus mechanism, does it have implications on the use cases for Chia, or like are there things it'll do better, or?
It does, and I wouldn't claim that I did it. Bram Cohen invents BitTorrent. BitTorrent, Bitcoin named an homage to BitTorrent. This is where the brilliance is. But we posit in 16 and 17 that a lot of institutions like commercial banks and government entities looked at blockchain in the state of the art at the time, and couldn't be seen using the kinds of power proof of work use. Plus, when you start looking at Solidity deeply, the North Koreans proved to us that the billions of dollars of Solidity dollars lost weekly, monthly, there's a real problem there from a security aspect of is Solidity ready for billions to trillions of dollars of transfers. And so
Staci, had that a thing?
No, I just wanted to sort of enthusiastically agree with that. It's the kind of language that you could build Facebook with it, but you wouldn't want to fly airplanes with it, right? So,
yeah.
And we have our machine language teal is very much, it doesn't, not to interrupt you and talk about me, but I'm mostly trying to agree with you.
Yeah.
That it's not as fun a language to kind of program because it doesn't let you make mistakes. It doesn't let you bring a bunch of garbage into the code. It's very, very careful about what you can use, but it enables you to scale much more than, everybody saw what's happening with some of the, the more successful your project is on Ethereum, the more it undermines the project because it gets very expensive to deploy.
But back to the question, the fact that you now have proof of work style security means that like commercial banks and governments who would love to have had the marriage of Ethereum and Bitcoin back in the day can actually have a technology platform that's credible there. And one of the big problems we've had is the cryptocurrency world has been full of hucksterism. And it hasn't necessarily been focused on actually going and solving these technology problems. And so a lot of what we're all doing, and I think you guys are doing the exact same thing, is going out to real institutions saying, now is the time, here are the trade-offs, and you can finally use these technological advancements to solve real problems, to do real things in real-world applications.
Okay. I'm just going to throw in a question from the audience here to John on what are the most ambitious use cases that you see clients pursuing using blockchain? The crazy stuff.
The most ambitious, I guess that's very relative, but in my personal view, any proper use case on blockchain is extremely ambitious because at the end of the day, it's around the development of a community and an ecosystem. Coming from a wholesale cap markets background, that would mean that you would be collaborating in some way with your competition or your competitive, organizations. And so, as you can imagine, when you look at the banking sector or
John,
the sell-side sector,
come on, give us a use case.
The use case, I'll tell you, the tokenization play of debt instruments, I think, and how that would actually transform the market industry as it exists today is probably very, very ambitious. If I look at even something like a T2S that took a decade to do, and quite frankly,
yeah.
what was the overall benefit of that? I'm not going to say there wasn't one, but a decade. And when you look at a transformation play of going from an open outcry in a trading floor in a trading pit to going 100% electronic, I do think that something along this lines is going to be of that magnitude. And it's probably not at the very beginning, but I am starting to see a big inflection point on when this can actually occur. So I would look at the most ambitious piece would be within the digital asset ecosystems of conventional instruments, but also setting the stage for new and growth instruments. And again, one of the things that I've been keeping a very close eye on is, I'll say, the voluntary carbon market as it exists today and how inefficient the market infrastructure is to support that market and what this can actually bring. And this is, again, a mechanism by which you can probably look to scale. And from a solution standpoint, I'm not going to say that it's all there, but it's getting closer.
Can I suggest that there are 1.7 billion with a B people, 20% of the global population, that does not have access to financial services of any kind. They can't save, they can't invest, they can't buy insurance, they can't take out credit of any kind. Imagine living your life like that. At the same time, you can send a movie from Nigeria to Malaysia in 1 minute, a movie through WhatsApp. It's not that hard, but you can't send $10 from Nigeria to Malaysia without traveling through the US correspondent banking system, layer and layer and layer, clearing at the Fed, layer and layer and layer, back down, right? It's unbelievable. So the idea that all of these transactions could be written to one ledger, that you can send money, you can send value in the same way that you send information across the internet, that's what we're trying to do. That's the big, that's the dream, right? That you can bring people in who have no access to this right now and can begin to live lives that in the same way that you and I live our lives.
So we have some more questions on energy consumption, but since we're talking about the green space, what traditional finance likes to do is measure these things. And we talked about green bonds briefly earlier, and to have a taxonomy around it, and in general a framework that helps make companies and either equities or fixed income instruments comparable on where they are, and you can score them even if those scoring mechanisms aren't always perfect and still needs to develop.
But ESG scoring mechanisms.
ESG scoring mechanisms.
Yep.
Should we have something similar in the blockchain space? Is that a question?
I think by definition, you're going to need some of these elements. Does it need to be specific to blockchain, or does it need to be more specific to the business use case or the actual asset that you're looking at? And so I would say that would be a contributing element, a contributing data point, but not the only one.
Jaynti, on the question of ESG frameworks or scoring or transparency, do you have a particular view on that?
Yeah, so we are working with CCRI, crypto-related carbon rating. So we work with other blockchains, UNICEF, Consensus, Carbonex. So I think that would also be kind of useful for the blockchains like crypto sustainability. Apart from that, I would like to say that it is like looking crypto as new industry in the carbon instead of using that as a similar as a finance fintech, right? Similar to fintech, like you can always assume that this is similar to fintech and use that tech as a sustainability. I think that would be also solve like this sustainability problem in the crypto as well.
Okay.
Before you go on to another question, can I just say one thing about that? I think an interesting way to frame it is not so much the standards on blockchains per se, because as you said, this is being done and is interesting to do. But what's really interesting is how the blockchain can help enforce and make transparent the implementation of standards in other areas. And so the idea that the kind of blockchain transparency can bring credibility to the attempts to know whether traditional financial corporations or other corporations are actually adhering to standards. That's the interesting thing, I think, for in this space.
The problem with the standards is you need one, and there's more than one right now. So just by definition, how do you actually go and streamline and rationalize it? And even if you look at TCP/IP, how did that become a standard? There was no governing model that said you must use TCP/IP. It evolved because that was the one that had the most value, and that's the one that was actually the greatest adoption. And next thing you know, it kind of, I'll call it the network effect in terms of actually how it gets adopted. And I do think that some of the ESG reporting standards is kind of heading in that direction. You see a lot of them right now. I look at some of the principles that are coming out of the organizations or the self-certifying organizations when I think about what TCFD is doing, how that ties into TSVCM. These are all standards bodies that are kind of looking at the principles of how you would actually score. At the end of the day, as you start looking at which ones are being recognized and how can they actually go and be effectively reported in a cost-effective manner, I think is the one that's going to ultimately go and win. And I do think that where the blockchain piece comes in is ultimately the operational cost to support any type of verification and validation. And this is where some of the smart contract logic that comes in can actually really, really bring some improvements and benefits to that.
So we had seen sort of 1 or 2 years ago that the prices for hardware on graphics cards got sort of severely impacted as a lot of the work on blockchain was heating up a lot. Jean, do we have to worry about prices for disk space now that Chia is going to use space and time?
So when we launched, we had the unfortunate moment of launching when at the same time most buyers in the pandemic were also buying their storage. So we caused a little bit of a supply chain burp at the time. But today, actually, the #1 way to farm is to buy used hard drives or use the drive you already have. There's about 8 zettabytes of storage in the world. 1 zettabyte of that is free. And so ultimately, you're competing with someone who's got that hard drive on anyway.
But do I need it to be performant to a certain standard?
Not at all.
Or?
If it can store anything that you want to store at all, it works. In fact, right now, people use hard drives because those are the cheapest total cost of ownership to store a terabyte over time. We're very close to a switch where we're going to move to enterprise solid state storage. And at that point, without spinning disks, you go about 1,000 times more efficient. So the ultimate Chia farming device is a about to be retired enterprise SSD, because you write your farm one last time and you read from SSDs, and SSDs do not wear out on read, they wear out on write. And so it's an ultimate where we're going to end up, and we're excited about that because we end up with Western Digital and Seagate, Bill McDonough with the Circular Drive Initiative, getting data centers to stop shredding this stuff and actually selling it on to our farmers for a second life.
So, but I don't need to dust off my old floppy disks.
But when you buy that next like 20 terabyte NAS and you only got 2 terabytes on it, you can make money with the other 18.
Interesting question on potential downside of using blockchain despite the benefits such an approach would bring. Very wide question. Anybody in particular who's keen to take that?
Well, I do think there's one thing, which is the idea that people think blockchains are somehow anonymous. They're not. They're the exact opposite of anonymity. And I think in certain ways we're going to have to grapple what that means in certain applications. People talk about CBDCs and these other tools. They potentially could be a very frightening overarching complete control of what's going on a blockchain. Now, when we're talking about these things where we're creating standards and building enterprise use cases, it's very different. But it is important to note that there are some unique new challenges to everything being in the open.
Since we are talking challenges, we have heard that the use cases are very promising, and especially for the financial markets and payments. But what are the challenges that those traditional players face when looking at implementing blockchain use cases?
May I? Regulatory uncertainty.
Sorry,
regulatory uncertainty. So there's a story I like to tell. Bram and I ran emusic.com. He and I kind of pincered the music business and helped them through that revolution. Someone was going to get hurt, and those people were Tower Records and others. Now, of course, the studios and the record labels and the artists were going to survive that transition. What's neat here is that if you're a big commercial bank, you're an investment bank, you issue a lot of debt, you're going to survive 80%. Citibank's International Wire Desk is not going to do so well, but Citibank as an entity is going to do just fine. And so there's a lot of real interest in these major financial institutions to adopt the transformative capabilities, but they're very worried because you've got and I think for some reasons because of how badly some crypto projects have done, that regulators are concerned that adopting this technology means you're adopting the hooliganism that was things like Terra Luna, right? So I think that's one of the biggest real challenges today of getting these real world use cases on and move forward. But I think the way we would address that is we do things like create a voluntary carbon market that has depth and some confidence and trust in it, and use that to show that it can work in debt, and then you use that to show that that can work in equity as well.
I think that's one of the reasons why when we talk about the use cases, I kind of look at the conventional world today, but also where these new elements can come in and how a platform can theoretically service both. And I think one of the key things, especially when you look at heavily regulated financial instruments, the regulatory constructs and constraints definitely probably a little bit behind the curve, like regulatory bodies aren't necessarily the fastest moving organizations, But the fact that they are moving, they are evolving, they're starting to look at some of these principles of practice and some of the rules that are actually being drafted right now demonstrates that there is movement. And I completely agree with you, Gene, that like, all your tier 1 organizations right now, they'll be around. They're not gonna disappear. I mean, if you look at that extremist view where everything's gonna be peer-to-peer, we won't need a financial institution anymore. I mean, that's not realistic. But what I do think is that an organization that isn't aware of this transformation play and is kind of asleep at the wheel has the risk of losing more market share than say the 20% or whatever that might be. And so as you start to look at what those opportunities are, staying on top of that to ensure that the products and services that you have to your clients continue to remain relevant, but also being aware of where the space is moving, and then the ability to actually support that capability is sort of where all the organizations are definitely heading right now.
Yeah, let me just say maybe two things as my closing remarks. One is that I think this bridge can be gapped with the wider spread application of something that the cryptocurrency ecosystem is really beginning to embrace, has embraced, but in more and more applications, is called a zero knowledge proof. And it was co-invented by the founder of Algorand when he was a professor at MIT. And it is this idea, it's a little bit hard to get your head around it, that you can prove something to be true without saying what that thing is. And so that if you could demonstrate to regulators that you are following the rules properly, that you have done things properly without having to give the regulators your secret sauce, your secret algorithm, or if you can demonstrate that your will is really what you wanted, and that will could be executed automatically. So you could, you're going to disintermediate the entire probate courts. You die, you show proof that you die, and your assets will be distributed by smart contract. That doesn't exist right now. But this idea that you could show that something is true without having to reveal the details of it is, I think, going to be a very important, widespread next step to bridging the kinds of gaps that these two have talked about. And then the last thing I want to say, I guess is my closing point, is that I've been watching a number of these questions scroll forward, and there's been quite a few about real world to blockchain. How do you know these? And I think it's important to keep in mind that the blockchain guarantees you integrity, but it does not guarantee you truth. So there is no claim by any blockchain that the data that comes in is the right data. It's only saying that once the data is there, it can't be touched, it can't be messed with after the fact. So that's the value proposition that the blockchain technology gives you broadly.
Jaynti, since you're remote, any closing remarks from your side? Truth
Yes.
versus integrity?
Yeah, definitely. So as Staci mentioned, zero knowledge proof. So we actually use zero knowledge proofs a lot in Polygon, the next release of the Polygon tech. And exactly what she said, you can always have an integrity in the blockchain. So what you can do is just you can kind of create a proof of transaction, submit into that in the blockchain, and blockchain basically verifies that proof and kind of stores those things for you. So I think there is great use case for the blockchain itself. I'm also seeing, I think this has been also discussed many times in the widely in the Web3 space, is a DAOs, right? Like autonomous organizations on the blockchains. It is very also powerful, that concept where you don't have to trust each other anymore and still work together, complete some tasks and do some work on the blockchain. I think it's a powerful use case as well for the blockchain.
Thank you. Thank you for the awesome panel, and thanks to the audience for the amazing questions.
Standing room only, Martin, you have it.
Yeah.
Wow. Great, good stuff. Thank you.